Hello and welcome to Fantasy View, a podcast about reviews for fantasy novels, because I've read a whole hell of a lot and I want to give you my recommendations for what to read, what to skip, and what to burn, but only after you pay for it, of course. I'm Jason Hubbard. Let me tell you, I have a Kindle Fire number 6, which I like plenty much. The main reason why I got it is because shortly after publishing my own ebook, The Taming of Adam, I realized there's this huge burgeoning marketplace of independently published authors like me. Now, I believe most of these authors, perhaps the overwhelming majority, are romance authors because, who doesn't enjoy reading about two sweaty bodies rolling around with each other? And I'm sure it's just as enjoyable writing about it too. But many of the authors are fantasy authors as well. And I decided, I want to take a chance on many of these independently published authors. I don't want to rely so much on the authors who have contracts with the big publishers because many of these authors deserve a chance, which is, one reason why I decided to start this podcast. And as you might know, it's much more convenient and easy to publish your book through electronic means because, I've tried writing to literary agents every summer for the past few years, and I've got nothing but rejection letters, which have led me to cry into my pillow late at night. I don't really do that, except for maybe that one time. Thanks to the digital revolution, there are now so many authors out there who have taken the chance to get their work out there and make it available for sale. But of course, as with any revolution, there are upsides and downsides. An upside is that there are so many people who can make creative stories, and they do this without having to play it safe, if you know what I mean. And as I've said, many of these people deserve a chance. Just take a look at my review for Revenge of the Elf, for instance. The downside is anyone with a few $100s to burn can write a book and get it published, regardless of whether or not they're actually talented and whether or not they're willing to put out a very polished and well-edited piece of work. Because if you think the online publishers do the editing for each book, you will be wrong. Now, of course, the online publishers do have people who look over each book, people who format it into ebook form, and I'm sure they run searches for each book, looking up certain terms, because, of course, they wouldn't want to publish any pro-Nazi propaganda bullshit or anything like that. The result is that there are plenty of books out there that were released even though they needed more time in the editing process. For example, the subject of this next review, Stone Heart, which is actually part 3 of a series called Heart of the Staff. It looks like this book has 2 authors, Carol Mars Phipps and her husband, I believe, Tom Phipps. Now, straight up, at the very beginning, this book really rubbed me the wrong way. There were typos that regularly showed up, usually like missing words or even extra words. No misspellings that I can remember. I'll give the book that much credit. There are no blatant misspellings. And as I saw more and more typos, I was starting to worry. I was wondering, oh man, how much worse is this going to get? And there's also something wrong with the font. I mean, it's certainly not ideal because, on the Kindle, you can choose how big or how small the text is. Well, right away when I opened up the book, the words were absolutely huge. And there are just so few words on each page. And I changed the settings so that there were the most number of words on each page. But even then, there were too few words on each page than I would have liked. And as if that wasn't enough, for the first few chapters, the font looks kind of normal. But then immediately, at a chapter change, the font turns to all boldface. And it remains boldface from that point on. I just can't help but wonder, what the hell happened there? It doesn't really break the book or anything. I mean, the text is perfectly legible, of course. But still, I just can't help but wonder, how could they have overlooked this before it went to press, so to speak? But in spite of the poor editing, I am happy to report that the book is at least perfectly legible, because the typos never reach that point where it leaves you confused and makes you wonder if this had actually been written by some alien from outer space or something. Now, the writing style is, I'd say it's very minimalist, because the narration is used very minimally. This is a very dialogue-heavy story. Much of the exposition is told through dialogue. A character has to ask another, "What's this? What's going on?" And the other character, pretty much explains what the hell is going on for the convenience of the reader. This is not my preferred style, honestly, but it does work. Especially since the characters who do the expositing, they don't sound like they're just reading aloud from a textbook or something. They sound natural and they still sound in character. But even so, I believe the authors could work a little more on their narrative flow. Like, for example, and this is the best example in the book, because after I read this thing, I tried looking for some more examples, but fortunately, there aren't a lot of examples like this. Now, there's a point where three characters they're on the run, and they reach a relative place of safety. One character is named Fuzz, who is a talking bear. A talking bear, because that's just the kind of story this is. Another character is a woman named Myrtle Bell, and her son, who has the rather unusual name of Edward. It's unusual because it sounds so normal. So Myrtle Bell gives Edward a bath and then sees him off to bed. And then she joins Fuzz in the living quarters where there's a fireplace. And it reads, "I'm pretending there's a fire, don't you know," Fuzz said, looking up with a very serious expression. "It's not hard to do after a supper like that." Myrtle Bell gave him an odd look as she sat on the braided oval rug before him. "Oh, we wouldn't dare light one," he said. "Who knows who would smell the smoke?" And then Fuzz drops a bomb. "And by the way, Myrtle Bell, I'm leaving in the morning." End of chapter. Oh! Smack! Oh, Fuzz just laid the smack down on Myrtle Bell. Oh, because he's going to be leaving first thing in the morning. I mean, he could stay, but he's not. And so, what is Myrtle Bell going to say about that, huh? Well, it doesn't say, or at least the book doesn't say right away. That's the very end of the chapter. And the next chapter doesn't pick up the conversation. But, you know what? You know what Myrtle Bell's going to say? She's going to say, "Well, fine. Fine then. Screw you. If you're going to leave, why wait for morning? Just go right now. Just go right now. There's the door. And try not to let it hit you on your big hairy ass." Yeah, that's what Myrtle Bell says, because, the book just leaves that up to my imagination. And so, yeah, that's what she said, because I said so. I mean, is it just me, or does that seem a little off to you? Because, by the way, Myrtle Bell, I'll be leaving in the morning. That doesn't seem like a closing line of dialogue. It just seems like an opener, rather. It encourages some more conversation to follow. I mean, I would like to know what Myrtle Bell has to say about that, and then maybe I can read about the two of them making plans for what to do after leaving the safe place. But instead, this line of dialogue is used as a closer. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's just to leave me in suspense, but it just doesn't work. And that's just bad narrative flow right there. If you read a lot of book reviews, the term narrative flow will pop up every now and then. As near as I can tell, narrative flow is just the steady stream of information that a book or a story just gives you in order to make you, it allows you to understand what's going on and to, know the characters and everything you need to know about the world. Good narrative flow is something you just don't notice because, the story is doing its job. It's giving you just enough information at the right time so that you can just absorb yourself in the story and enjoy just what's going on. But bad narrative flow, you always notice because it leaves you scratching your head and asking questions. It doesn't give you just enough information. It might make you wonder, what the hell's going on? What's this place? Who are these people? Or in this case, what does Myrtle Bell have to say about that? Does she approve of Fuzz about to leave or disapprove? What? I want to know. But as I said, that's the most extreme example in this book. except maybe for one other, but I'll just get to that later. So I would be more bitter about this book if the story wasn't any good. But fortunately, the story is pretty good. It certainly held my attention and made me read the story all the way to the end. Of course, I would do that anyway for the sake of this review, but still, I did enjoy myself. Now, I believe the story is inspired by, or at least in part, by The Wizard of Oz. Now, when you think of The Wizard of Oz, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Singing and dancing, of course. We are the Lollipop Guild, the Lollipop Guild. And there's also lions, tigers, and bears, oh my, and the Yellow Brick Road, and some guy hanging himself in the background. Let's not forget him. And of course, there's the Wicked Witch of the West. And what does she do? Well, at the very end of the movie, she does torture, of course. She does torture, and along with her winged servants, or winged monkey men. Not a lot of people remember that, usually, but still, torture. You know, they pull apart this straw man, and I'm not sure exactly what they do with the others, but the winged servants were about to do something nasty to Dorothy, and then Dorothy throws water onto the witch, and she melts, and you know, it's kind of a weak story element, really, but you know, still, it's a classic. Well, this story, Stoneheart, begins with a witch inside her fortress, and she is torturing somebody. How exactly? The book doesn't really say. Clearly the word torture is in there, but other than that, it doesn't go into really scant details. And there's the man who is brought to her by two of her servants, and this man also happens to be her husband. And she gives him a bloody nose by ramming her knee right into it. And she does something else, but clearly she is a major bitch. And if you ever wonder whether she's evil or not, well, her very name pretty much gives it away. Her name is Demonica. It has the word demon in it, in case you actually missed it. And she has a granddaughter whose name is Spite Morta, and that has the word spite in it. And it's far less subtle, but still, a name like Spite Morta can't be good. And she has a son whose name is Abaddon. Freaking Abaddon. Now, in case you don't know, Abaddon is simply another name for the devil. Or it can also be considered another name for hell. But, you know, there you go. Freaking Abaddon. The story begins when Demonica discovers the location of a magical MacGuffin called the Staff, or maybe you could call it the Great Staff. And of course, this tells you the staff doesn't really have a special name. It's just called the Staff, which is something I approve of. You know, sometimes when you have a magical MacGuffin, you don't need to call it a really fancy name because it can be one of a kind, you know. A simple name can indicate that this magical MacGuffin is very powerful and there's nothing else quite as powerful as it. You know, kind of like the One Ring, you know, the Ring of Power. That pretty much tells you, there may be other magical rings, but this one is the one, the One Ring. So where is the Great Staff? It's in the hands of Spite Morta, and so surprisingly, you know, Demonica doesn't conspire to take the staff for her own. Instead, she wants to help her granddaughter by finding yet another magical MacGuffin, the one right in the title, the Stoneheart, which, you know, supposedly if you put it into the very tip of the staff, it makes the staff much more powerful. So the beginning of the story is pretty much like a chase thriller because Demonica and Spite Morta, they go off to the certain area which is covered in forests and swamps in order to find the Stoneheart. And the Stoneheart is held in safekeeping by Fuzz. So, you know, naturally they put Fuzz and Myrtlebell and Edward on the run. At the same time, there are other characters, the good guys from previous installments in the series, who they go to this area via ship in order to visit good friends of theirs. And so naturally, these good guy characters are going to catch wind of these two witches trying to find the Stoneheart and, you know, chasing Fuzz and Myrtlebell, which is really just one hell of a coincidence. Coincidence. It's a writer's very best friend, if they want it to be. So who are these friends that the good guys are going to visit? Well, they're dragons. Now, before you start gushing your nerd love for dragons, and before you perhaps even bring up Daenerys and her 3 pet dragons, please check your enthusiasm at the door, because these dragons are nothing like the 3 dragons of Daenerys. Because for one thing, these dragons talk. And not only that, but they are super polite. They are just so polite, it's almost comical. Because they sound like English gentlemen, really. Now, I believe the 2 authors themselves are British, which might help to explain this. But still, sometimes it cracks me up just thinking about these dragons, these huge reptiles, talking like English gentlemen, saying things like, "Hip hip, cheerio, old boy. A very good morning to you, and a very good evening to you." Fearsome and bloodthirsty creatures these guys are not. Which is okay, you know. Dragons are fictional characters, of course, and you can mold them any way you want. But still, it just cracks me up. And it's a little odd, too, because they eat animals raw, or almost raw. There are a few cases where a dragon just picks up a rodent and just pops it right into their mouth, and as you can imagine, the bones just crunch right between their teeth and just gulp it down in one swallow. And yet they remain just so super polite whenever they talk. They can eat like ferocious creatures, and yet they're just so polite, it's almost cute. Now, there's this one instance in which you have several dragons talking to each other, and they're eating pickled voles. Now, a vole is a type of rodent, which I didn't know that before. And so these rodents are pickled. And one of them, he takes a pickled vole and he squeezes it so that the eyeballs pop out of the skull. And so then he licks up the eyeballs, putting them into his mouth. And then he just puts the rest of the head into his jaws and crunches it up. And yet, despite this, they don't talk like savages. They talk like perfectly polite English gentlemen. It's such a strange and surreal scene. At least for me, it is. You know, if I were to actually see this, like perhaps in a movie or something, I'd be like, "Whoa, am I really seeing this, or am I just tripping balls here?" So anyway, besides the 2 evil witches. Another thing which makes me think that the authors drew some inspiration from The Wizard of Oz is something called the Peppermint Forest. It's a forest made out of peppermint. It's explained that in the previous book, there was another witch, Spite Morta's mother, in fact, whose name was Uglia. Uglia. Ugly, get it? And just on a whim, this witch just turned this whole forest into peppermint. Now, there is nothing like the peppermint forest in The Wizard of Oz. But even so, in some of those Oz books, there is a town made up entirely of china. And, even the residents there are made up of china, which you can see in the movie Oz the Great and Powerful. But, it doesn't take a great stretch of the imagination to imagine something like the Peppermint Forest in The Wizard of Oz. But one thing that makes Stoneheart rather different from The Wizard of Oz is its tone. It has definitely a more mature tone. The Wizard of Oz is perfectly suitable for kids, but this is more suitable for young adults at the very least. For one thing, there's torture. Demonica explains to Spite Morta that she does torture on a pretty regular basis, and she just loves doing torture. She even recommends that her granddaughter try it out herself. And there's even a point where they actually skin a man. This man is he's kind of like a savage, and they end up skinning him to turn his skin into leather, if you follow me. Now, there's simply no detail on how they skin this guy, but it's pretty obvious that they skin him. They say they're about to skin him. A few chapters later, they say that they're done skinning him, and Demonica asks Spite Morta what she's going to do with this skin. Well, I forget what, and frankly, I I don't want to try and remember. There's also another important story element about a constant war between elves and trolls. Now, the trolls are pretty much at war with the elves, not because they hate them, but because they eat them. They eat them. They don't eat humans, they eat elves because they desire their flesh. It's as simple as that. And again, there's simply no details given about what the trolls do exactly with the elves that they capture, but still, there's no bones about it. Characters say that trolls eat elven children, so that's going into pretty dark territory, and I'm pretty glad that the authors decided not to give any details more than necessary. And the two witches, Demonica in particular, they hatched this truly evil scheme concerning the trolls. And I'll give the authors this much credit. If they wanted me to squirm a little, they certainly did it with this plot line. And really, one part of this book that I really liked was the exchanges between the two witches. You have the older and wiser Demonica, who's trying to be a tutor to her granddaughter, who's wielding the great staff, and she's trying to teach her granddaughter to be calm and patient and just plan ahead. When Spite Morta is really she's hot-headed, and whatever she wants it right now. It's a classic kind of relationship between two villains, and it certainly works here. So what about the good guys, and who are they exactly? Yes, I've been stalling on them long enough. Well, there's one guy whose name is Raz Morton. How's that for a name? He is simply a wise old wizard. Basically, he's the Gandalf stand-in. But unlike Gandalf, Raz Morton is capable of procreation. His daughter, Minuet, is the queen of a kingdom called Niarg. God, these names. And there's a prince named Lucas, or maybe it's pronounced Lucas, because there are two U's in there. There's also his sister Rose, and two talking parrots. One of them is named Pebbles, and her mate, Hubba Hubba. Hubba Hubba. If that's some kind of inside joke, I like to be inside of it. And really, I would like to ask the authors what they were thinking when they came up with the name Hubba Hubba. Hell, I like to ask George Lucas why he went with the name Jar Jar Binks. Shit. Well, anyway, these good guy characters are only mildly interesting. Lucas, it's Lucas. He's married, and his wife is an elf, and she's pregnant. And his sister Rose, well, she falls in love and gets married. Seriously, yes, there is a romance story in this, kind of a romance subplot. And it happens faster than any Disney animated movie you have ever seen. I mean, Rose meets this guy, and a little bit later, after they start talking, she's like, you know what? I'm hot, you're hot. Let's get hitched. My biological clock is ticking, baby, and it's almost reached its end. Well, okay, she doesn't mention her biological clock, but still, she is in one hell of a hurry. I wish I could meet a girl like that. So that's pretty much all I want to say about the story. But there is one last thing I want to say, which is about the ending. Now, I'm not going to give the ending away, but I just want to say that this story just ends so abruptly. I knew at the end of the book there was a so-called dramatis personae, a list of all the characters, as well as a glossary for all of the made-up terms found throughout the book. So when I came upon the dramatis personae, I was very surprised because the ending is a cliffhanger, but which is okay, of course. It's part 3 of a 5-part series at least. But even so, when you have a cliffhanger in a story, there should be some kind of lead-in to the next story, some kind of build-up. But there's simply none of that here. But there's no lead-in. It just ends abruptly, as if the authors expect you to just go to the next book right away. It's just awkward, and that's the second example of bad narrative flow that I mentioned before. And yeah, I mentioned a glossary before because This book is littered with made-up terms. They just crop up every now and then. Some of the terms you can learn and get used to, but every now and then, I don't know, especially this one chapter with elves, there's a bunch of made-up terms, and I had no idea what the hell they meant. Of course, that's what the glossary is there for, but it's kind of a pain in the ass going back and forth between the glossary and your last place in the book, on a Kindle, that is. You have to, make a bookmark and then open up the side menu and go to the glossary, and then you have to flip through all these electronic pages, finding the term that you're looking for. By the time you find it, you couldn't care less anymore. You just want to go back to the story, which I never really did this myself because I knew it was going to be a big old pain in the ass. So yeah, this is one of those fantasy stories with quite a number of made-up terms. And if you can be irritated by something like this, I totally understand. It's not all that fun being confused by something you're trying to read. Even so, I don't let it bother me all that much, just as long as I'm just enjoying the story. And so that's Stoneheart, which is part 3 of Heart of the Staff. And no, I didn't bother reading the first 2 parts, which I know I really should have, but what the hell? It's not the first time I jumped right into the middle of a series, and it probably won't be the last. Because I think I'm like some kind of super reader who can pick up on a story in the middle just like that and not be totally lost. I must admit, though, it really was a challenge picking up the story from the middle, because the book really assumes that the reader has read the previous 2 installments. You could chalk it up to the minimalist style of writing. There's just so little narration. The narrator hardly bothers explaining what happened in previous installments. Another thing the narration doesn't do is describe environments and buildings and other structures. It leaves a lot to the imagination, which I imagine some readers might prefer. They just like to say, oh, okay, they're in a castle, they're in a fortress. I can imagine that well enough. But even so, I like to have some idea about what the places look like. So ultimately, do I recommend Stoneheart? Well, yeah, sure. I found it to be a pretty pleasant time waster. There's some parts that were genuinely gripping, and even though it seems like a simple soap opera or drama at times, the story is ultimately rewarding, abrupt ending notwithstanding. But of course, there's the poor editing to consider. If poor editing really drives you up the walls, then you may want to steer clear. And so that wraps it up for this episode. Thank you for listening, and please keep reading.